I just thought I'd begin with some introductions. I want to thank everybody for joining us. For those that are either watching live and joining us in the webinar, or will probably see this later on. I know that there are many that with conflicts will be able to watch this later as well. And I'm grateful for you, Dr. Kevin Watson, for you to join us and take this time out of your busy schedule to be with us. A little introduction to those of you that may not know Kevin as well as some of us have gotten to know. Kevin is now serving as the Director of Academic Growth and Formation at Asbury Theological Seminary in Tulsa, which is a new transition for them and very exciting position. But he's a Wesleyan scholar and one who has written a lot about Wesleyan discipleship, about Wesleyan faith and theology, including for us, maybe most specifically, the book called The Class Meeting, Reclaiming a Forgotten and Essential Small Group Experience, which personally has been a big impact to me in my ministry, as over the last several years, it's been an incredible resource to help Wesleyan discipleship groups to begin, not just the Class Meeting book, but also his work with Dr. Kisker on the Band Meeting book as well. And so you've probably read or heard of his name in other places. One of my favorite books that you've ever wrote, Kevin, is Perfect Love. I think that's a beautiful book for the church, for anybody in the church to read, and an important piece that brings a theological and compelling call for what class meeting and band groups are all about. And so I just recommend that to everyone that's with us. Our hope and goal and prayer tonight is that this would be an opportunity, a resource to help churches across our conference. And I think even beyond our conference, there's people that will be joining or watching this online, to help begin or to encourage and stoke on the continuation of Wesleyan discipleship groups in our churches as a critical piece of who we are as Methodists. We've done some work in our conference, Kevin, to sort of define some language about discipleship, so that I think discipleship has been one of those words that kind of means a whole lot of things and doesn't really mean anything at the same time. And so really just trying to create a Wesleyan a vision of what it looks like for our conference. And we've come to a really simple line. I won't give you the long definition of the life as Jesus' disciple is always devotional, transformational, and missional. And a location for that to take place is definitely the class meeting. And so the class meeting committee, because we have committees in the Methodist Church, but the class meeting committee has been charged to reintroduce and to encourage and equip churches to bring class meetings into their church. I'll give you the definition we've landed with class meeting, but I also want to hear from you about what class meeting was and why it was important, and give us some historical context. But we've defined class meeting as this simply: a class meeting is a transformational small group of people who meet weekly to give testimony to their life in God and to encourage one another in the pursuit of becoming more like Jesus. And so that's where we've kind of landed. And before I forget and toss it to you, Kevin, I do want to tell everyone that's here, there will be time for Q&A. Zach Anderson, Reverend Zach Anderson is with us. The screen's dark, but he'll be monitoring the chat and questions and answers. He'll be answering some online when he can. And then at the end, we'll save some time for people to that we might be able to respond, that Kevin might be able to respond to some of those questions. So I want you to know that that's there as well for those that are live in the webinar. And I guess I better introduce myself. My name is John Wayne McMahon. I am a pastor at First Methodist Conroe in North Houston. I am deeply involved in Wesleyan discipleship groups in this church, but also outside of this church, and helping people to see and to respond to what God can and does do in the midst of these groups, which has led me to the opportunity to lead this committee for the conference. And so when we were dreaming about where to go with this, we thought we'd shoot our shot and invite Kevin to be a part of this conversation. And so our hope, Kevin, is that we can just encourage folks to help aim them, equip them, maybe even embolden them to step into this old method, this method that's part of our roots and who we are, and is a location in which God does and God creates opportunities for transformation and growing in grace. So, Kevin, why don't I be quiet and toss it to you? Historically, tell us about the class meeting a little bit and the location of this sort of discipleship. What's unique or important about the class meeting in the history of the Methodist Church, and why is it so important to the Wesleyan movement?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, just thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be connected to you and Zach in particular and the work that you all are doing. And I'm really excited by the energy in East Texas for a return to kind of what I would say are kind of the basics of who we are as a people called Methodists. And so I'm just excited to get to partner with y'all in the work that the Spirit is doing in your conference. I'd say the class meeting in terms of like kind of its distinctive contribution in early Methodism is that a Methodist for decades and decades, really at the most basic level, was a person who met weekly with their class meeting, which is probably surprising to almost all Methodists today, unless they already know about the class meeting from your work and the way it's kind of had a resurgence. But for the most part, in contemporary American Christianity anyway, we tend to think that the most basic thing a person does is go to worship on Sunday. And it wasn't that in early Methodism worship was seen as unimportant. It's just that there was a sense that we want to have a place where everybody who has taken up membership vows, who's made a commitment to Methodism, has a place of belonging, a place where they're known, and I think where everybody knows your name. I can't resist the kind of Cheers reference. Like, it's just this kind of sense of like, it's a small enough group of people that if you're not there, it's easy for the group to notice, right? It's actually hard for them not to notice. And so the groups usually would have around 7 to 12 people in them. And the idea was that it was the right amount of people where, you can't help but have some kind of relational connectedness, but also that you would be able to share, like everybody actually is engaged actively in the group. And so the basic thing that would happen in class meetings in early Methodism was that each person would share about the state of their soul. I think the original question is how does your life prosper? How does your soul prosper? Not life. How does your soul prosper? And I always like to point out that I think today the language of prosperity has some baggage. We think about the prosperity gospel, some of those kind of, like, I would say, like, misunderstandings or less than ideal ways of talking about the gospel. But I also think that at least in some of the places I've been, there's kind of an overreaction to that doesn't leave room for, like, the Christian life is about prospering your soul. There is an expectation, right? Like, Methodists in particular are rightly optimistic about the ways that grace brings transformation and healing and wholeness into people's lives. And the class meeting was the place where people expected to see that happen. They expected people to actually come to faith through class meetings and then to grow in their faith, or what Methodists would describe as sanctification or holiness. So this is a context to go on to perfection in the early Methodist language. I think that today, like, what's helpful about that, just in terms of thinking about the DNA of, I mean, it's interesting in the Global Methodist Church, it's kind of, we're setting the DNA of a new institution, but we're doing it in existing institutions. Like the building blocks of the new institution are, for the most part, churches that have already existed, but are leaving one denomination and joining another one. And so it's, I'm saying that just to say there is still a challenge. We're not actually creating something from nothing. We have churches that have histories and have established patterns and those kind of things. But I really appreciate the bold vision by many leaders in the Global Methodist Church to also see this as an opportunity to kind of get back to the basics, to better understand who are we really and why does it matter. And so the class meeting, I think, kind of in terms of like how that all is important for us, is that people, I think, come to church, especially younger generations, looking for connection. And so churches that know how to do these kinds of Wesleyan small groups will be places that know how to plug people into places of meaningful connection and relatedness to each other. And I think that really is low-hanging fruit in our current cultural moment, but ironically something that Methodism lately hasn't done as well as some other parts of the body of Christ.
That's really helpful. I was just thinking, I'm leading a group that we're training to be class leaders currently, and one of the things I see in groups like this all the time is a kind of a disdain for the hard differentiation you make between informational and transformational groups in the book. And I think there's this, you say it too, there's an addiction to informational driven groups. And there's a challenge that how do we know that what we're doing is transformative if we don't have that information, the right learning that's there? And can you just speak to that a little bit about why these groups are transformational, why that's so important, and why it's okay that it's not a Bible study and based on curriculum, that we're not throwing everything out the window kind of thing? But will you just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, the fact that you would say yes to something like a class meeting does not, by definition, mean that you're saying no to other things, right? So it doesn't need to be sort of antagonistically pitting this against something else and saying this is good and the other thing is bad. Um, I think the image that I have had in kind of my mind for a while, I think it actually came through a class that I taught through a student, but was like the idea of thinking about like a football game, and that too often church is like the people who go to church go and they get in the seats in the stadium and they sit in the seats, but they actually aren't playing football. They're watching the teams play football, and they're not actually a part of the game, except that they're like in the way that, like, the Seattle Seahawks talk about the 12th man, like there's some sense that like home field advantage makes some impact, but nobody thinks they're throwing passes or catching balls or scoring touchdowns or kicking field goals. And I think that when you frame it in that way, for me anyway, it becomes pretty easy to see that that's not the vision of the Christian life in the New Testament. The New Testament vision for the Christian life is about following Jesus. It's about following a person, and allowing your life to be remolded and remade, and so that you can follow him, so you can be an effective kind of on mission and pointing other people to Jesus through your actions and the ways that you speak and so forth. And I think that it's really easy to, well, I'll put it this way. I think that in the 21st century, and then in the 20th century even more so, the church created a kind of approach to the gospel in the United States that was pretty broad spread across many denominations. So it's not a critique of Methodism, really. It's a critique, I think, of kind of dominant Christianity as a whole, that our approach really was like kind of come and cheer for the home team. Come to the worship service, and the kind of professionals they'll do the ministry and you'll observe it. And then there were other places where you had a little bit more kind of activity in a sense, but oftentimes the default was to talking about your faith in a kind of intellectual way, as opposed to talking about what was actually happening. Like, how am I following Jesus today? Do I have a way I can talk about that with other people? Am I willing to be held accountable for that, and so forth? And I think the class meetings uniqueness then is it's designed to actually change the sort of superstructure of the church so that there is no stadium seating. The entire church is the field, and everyone is in the game, because they're all being asked week after week, like, how's it going? Like, how is your faith? How's it working in your life? And that, I think, we've talked about this before, but I think it might be helpful for folks on the webinar. Like, the part of this is the beauty of it is that when you ask a question, really anything, right? Studies have shown over and over again, even outside of like specifically Christian work, whatever you measure, whatever you count impacts your behavior, right? So if you get on a scale every morning and you look at what the number is on the scale, it actually, studies have shown it impacts the choices that you make the rest of the day in terms of what you eat or don't eat, whether you exercise and so forth. It just has an impact. And so if you choose to step into a discipline where you measure your ability to speak to your lived experience of God, it will impact your behavior. It will also impact like kind of your spiritual antenna get more and more sensitive and attuned to the Holy Spirit, so that you start to notice the ways that the Lord is at work in your life that were probably happening before you just weren't really noticing, because you weren't looking at your life through the lens of expecting the Lord to be alive and active in your life. But we're more thinking about just, I hope I have the energy to get up and get to church on Sunday morning, right? Which is not bad. It's very, very good. But it's not the best, I guess, is the way I'd kind of point it.
Yeah, it's not everything. I love your image of the football, playing the football game. Although your reference to the 12th man with Seattle is going to tick off any Aggies that are on the webinar, but that's okay.
As it was coming out, I heard it. I was like, it's the wrong group. Like you totally missed like it was like you set it up on the tee and then you just somehow beamed yourself.
That's right.
So
That's right. I think what I've loved about watching people or observing people as they go through the class meeting, and as they begin to trust each other, there's a point in which they turn the corner, and to your language about now they're no longer reflecting on what God has done in the past week. They turn this corner and they start to see God at work right in front of them in real time, and they begin to feel what it is to live out that obedience and that following in the middle of it. And it's just captivating to me that something so simple like this could have such great fruit. It was a humbling experience when I first started to do class meeting, and I realized all of the things I'm doing in church and preaching and teaching, the fruit of what was happening when people were gathering together and praying together and testifying was crazy different than anything that I was seeing in the church. It was humbling and beautiful all at the same time. So Kevin, that leads me to the next this next question. I think there's probably new challenges that we face that are different than when class meetings existed, and largely to our conversation before this, I think a lot of that is the inoculation that we have with just kind of marginal faith and marginal Christianity. This is a deep invitation to bear one's soul with others, to trust someone, to have an high expectation of what God can do, and it's new and it's hard. Can you speak to that? Do you see that as a greater challenge that we see in all of our churches? Is that a Methodist problem? Is that something that we're just experiencing years and years of a different kind of Christianity? And what can we do about it in the middle of it when it comes to Wesleyan discipleship?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that there is a real temptation, and I think kind of the Lord is actually sifting the church right now in some ways because of this. Like we kind of went through a season where the goal actually often explicitly was purely attractional. Like, what do we have to do in order to attract people to come to the church? And it's not that wanting people to come to church is bad at all. It's just that if it shifts fully into marketing, like what are the programs that I need to put on? How is it that I should preach so that people want to come? Like you've kind of reversed the flow of how all of this works. And instead of like, how can people be stirred and awakened to the reality of the living Lord, and submit their lives to him and receive blessing from his hands? And I think that the challenge of previous kind of models and approaches has been that, I just think we have unintentionally taught people that the faith really is just cognitive. It's about studying ideas and studying scripture. But I think that in many places I think I sometimes am too sharp on some of this. Bible studies always intend to be application. I mean, one of the best selling Bible studies of all time is the Life Application Study Bible. And I think the reason it's sold so well is because people deeply resonate with this sense of like, I want to know how to apply the Bible to my life. And so maybe this one will help me with that. And I think it does do that in some really remarkable ways. And I think, but I still think that I think I just want to say it kind of in this kind of a directive a way. The thing that I've found, as I've been working on this for quite a while, is that it's kind of like you said, it's really not complicated. The problem is that it's vulnerable, and it actually never stops being vulnerable. If you're going to lead something like a class meeting, really what you're going to do is every week you're going to say the Holy Spirit gets the agenda. And if he doesn't show up, nothing is going to happen. It's going to be uncomfortable. And so I'm gonna show up and be willing to take that risk and trust that he will. And my experience is that, I've had some times where there were some awkward moments, but for the most part, it's consistently shocking to me, that when I take that step kind of in faith, that the Lord is so quick to come. And sometimes, so one of the things I think that class leaders do is they're really just holding space. They're holding that tension for, can we as a group come together to actually talk about what God's doing, and create that openness and space, because we know that if we don't do that, we'll kind of default to either small talk, to gossip, or to like safer places where we're just talking about the passage. I've noticed, like, there was a Bible study I was in for a long time with amazing people, but it would kind of shift pretty predictably into this kind of like, what did people really think then? And it just became this kind of intellectual abstraction, and sometimes at worst actually arguing with the clear meaning of the passage. Like, what couldn't have really meant that? Like, that's not credible, or that doesn't seem believable to us. And it kind of actually like would sometimes, come off the rails, as opposed to going back to the question of like, what is the Lord actually doing in me? And am I being faithful, or am I resisting the work that he's asking me to do? And one of the things that's at stake, I'd say, particularly for folks who are pastors or lay leaders who are watching, is I just think this is, I mean, the Holy Spirit is the antidote to burnout, but the way it works, I think, in day-to-day rhythms and living is actually seeing the Holy Spirit doing things in people's lives is what at least has kept me going in some really difficult seasons of ministry. Is that there haven't ever been times where when I was willing to create this kind of space, or use the position that I had to just create an opening for people to actually talk about their faith, in kind of the deep water, the Lord has just always showed up in those spaces. And that, it doesn't get any better than that. Like when you actually see someone who, like, the light has come on and they actually are like, I feel like I was missing something before, but I get it now. And like, it's like they've been activated. Like, that's as good as it gets. It's really what ministry's actually always been all about, is that the Lord is using one leader to raise up other leaders, not to just lead by themselves and people to sit and listen to them. But it's actually like the calling to leadership really is getting people out of the stands and onto the field in the game.
Yeah, that leads to another question that I don't want to forget. But just a comment. Even tonight, I have a group that we just got to week 8, so we've been together for 8 weeks, and this group will potentially start to lead other groups themselves. So this is part of kind of learning what the class meeting is, and considering what it entails and how they might lead this in the future. But 8 weeks in, Kevin, I could go around the room and I'm just blown away at what people are like receiving healing from pain decades ago, are witnessing to their faith at a food truck. I mean, this was all tonight, just hearing testimony after testimony after testimony, and it was just incredible. And it wasn't, we held space together for 8 weeks and gave room and challenged each other a little bit. Really, the challenging was about inviting people into a deeper search of what God's doing in their life, just by asking questions and praying for them. And so, yeah, it's incredible. And without fail, every time we go through this happens. There's a point where we're in a corner and it takes off.
Yeah,
I'm
so
gonna
good.
I'm gonna go down just a quick rabbit trail here. I've been particularly just compelled or convicted that we don't do a lot of creating disciple making lay leaders within the church. And one of the things that I think is very fascinating about the Wesleyan movement is the way in which lay leadership was created through this meeting. I just think that's a compelling thing. I think we've been too clergy dependent, and we've missed out on one of the great organic moves of the spirit of the Wesleyan movement, that I think class meetings are a great location for that. Will you speak to that a little bit, about how class meetings was a location for this kind of lay leadership development, not just the class leader, but everyone in a class meeting, and how that could possibly come back into our day as well as something that's important?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways that I could talk about this, but I think the first thing that comes to mind is I've been in a lot of contexts where I will hear people exhort rooms full of Christians about the need to do evangelism, to share their faith. And it strikes me that those conversations are usually, in my experience, like they're purely aspirational, and you get to a point where you realize like nothing's going to change from what's being said right here, like because the aspiration doesn't touch the like challenge or the lack of equipping to actually share faith. If somebody doesn't know how to share their faith, if you tell them they should share their faith, it's like a two ships passing in the night, right? And I actually think that virtually all Christians want to share their faith. There's not like people going around. It's more like I just don't know how though. I don't know how to do it in a way that won't be offensive, that will say the right things and not say the wrong things, and those kind of things. And that shouldn't be surprising to us if we're in contexts where people almost never speak to their faith in any real way, other than like I can give some idea. And this is the other problem. Like if your model for discipleship is entirely cognitive, then it's also easier to become more and more afraid of saying anything about your faith because you might say something that's wrong, like intellectually wrong, and that's like the big foul. Whereas if sharing your faith is actually about sharing your relationship with a person, it's not good if you're saying things that are about the person that aren't true. But it also is in the mode of testimony, which is different than in the mode of catechesis or a seminary class, right? The goal of faith sharing by lay people isn't to be able to teach a theology master's level class. It's to be able to say to somebody, I once was blind, but now I see, like Jesus rescued me. And here's what my life looked like before, and here's how it's changed. And that's actually an area where every person's an expert. Nobody knows more about kind of the details of what your life has been like and how it's been changed by the goodness of God than you do. And so I think that's just kind of an initial thing. But then I think the other piece is like in early Methodism, class leaders. I'm going to make a quick kind of distinction to sort of like parse how a church would work. So if you think about a preacher, and then you think about like a chaplain, in our context, preachers are people who preach on Sunday. Chaplains would be people who care for like the sick or people who are in difficult situations and they need a pastoral presence with them. Usually, like kind of in some kind of emergency situation. But there isn't an expectation when you think about those two things as vocations, that the two like that they don't necessarily go back and forth. And in early method today, most Methodist churches, the pastor in charge is expected to be both the preacher and the chaplain to their community. But in early Methodism, and I would argue the entire time really that it was a rapidly growing movement, those two jobs actually were pretty separate. You had a group of people who were the preachers of Methodism, and they were just constantly traveling around as much as they could to get the message out. So they were offering Christ, they were preaching the gospel, they were teaching the content of Scripture and so forth. And then they would move on to the next community, and oftentimes they'd have like a 6-week rotation, say that your preacher would come through town and preach and that kind of thing. And in the meantime, you needed people who were with you day to day that you could see in the middle of your life, but also would be there if something did happen where you needed to have someone provide immediate kind of pastoral care and support and so forth. And in early Methodism, those people were class leaders. The class leaders were really they weren't the preachers, but they were the pastors of Methodism in its beginnings. And I think that one of the most unfortunate things that happened in the historical development of Methodism was that as preachers stopped traveling on circuits and were anchored in churches, which I like. I mean, I think almost everybody would prefer to actually live in a community and have the stability that you have versus constantly being, traveling. And for those who don't know the history, that's also why most pastors in early Methodism were single men, and it just was not a vocation that was suitable to having a family. And so there were kind of challenges around those kind of things. But the development that was lamentable is that I think in a lot of instances when the circuit riding preacher got off of his horse and he settled down in a community and was there day after day for usually a year or two, appointments changed pretty fast, but a year is very different than once every 6 weeks. And I think a lot of times the preachers became threatened by the spiritual authority and leadership of their class leaders in their churches. And so it was almost like, well, why would you need your class leader to do that when the preacher's in town? Like, you can just go talk to him instead. And I think that was a truly lamentable shift, because every pastor knows that their job is better. They are able to be more effective to the extent that they have faithful, wise, saintly lay leadership in their church. Not people who can run committee meetings well, but people who can pray with other people who can share the faith, meet with coffee, and open up the scriptures, and those kind of things is crucial. And early Methodism had an embarrassment of riches in that. If you think about a church that had 100 people, and it would have 10 class leaders, and so the church actually could sustain really high level, excellent pastoral care solely through the lay leadership of the church. Because if you think about the way the class meeting works, if somebody doesn't come and you check in with them, you find out it's because they had a death in the family and they weren't able to make it, and they're struggling with that. And so then you see the need, but you also already have the mechanism in place for where that need can be cared for, where people won't get overloaded, right? If it's a kind of 10-to-1 ratio kind of thing. So those are my thoughts. I don't know if you have other ways you want to come back at that.
No, I think it's really good. I know there's a lot of factors that influence the kind of disappearing of the class meeting. You've written about it in other places, but I think that's a really helpful thing. I also think in our churches, we see lay leaders as those that can run a budget, and we don't look for those that can pray and shepherd and have spiritual giftings for that, which is a problem. Or those that have those giftings, we put them in the place to run the budget instead of in places to help shepherd and lead people as well. We need to be able to run the church and the finances and things, trustees and et cetera. But at the same time, where are we positioning people that have giftings to provide that care and leadership? So I think the class leader is a real opportunity. The other thing I was thinking about is in the class meeting, not only are we learning what it is to live out our faith, like again, the football image of playing on the field, but we also are learning to take some of the language of the knowledge and information and to apply it to what's happening in front of us in real time, what God's doing around us. I think for anybody that's listening, if I were to ask you right now, how is it with your soul? How does your soul prosper? How's your life in God? However you want to phrase the transformational question. If there's a little panic and a long pause about how to answer that, it's probably because we haven't thought about it very much, and we haven't seen the world through that lens. And this question amongst a group of people that are committed to one another has a real transformative power that takes us off the sidelines and into the playing field. So that's good, Kevin. We've got a lot of lay leaders and pastors that are watching. What encouragement would you give to a pastor or a lay leader or someone that's caught the compelling bug for this, but is looking at a church that's never done anything like this before? It's in some ways it's simple, but it's not as simple as giving somebody a curriculum and say, just do this or play the video and then do these discussion questions. And so how would you just encourage them? Where do we start is, I guess, the simple way of putting that.
Yeah. I think the first thing I would say is like a do not, and that is just don't let yourself get discouraged by the people who don't respond, but focus on the people who do. So if you're in a church that hasn't done this in a really long time and you have a small group drive or something, everybody's not going to sign up for it. And sometimes churches have amazing responses, and sometimes they don't. There's just not much interest. But if you have 3 people who are ready to say yes to this, then run with it. Like, pour into them, spend your time and energy there. I would say to pastors, if this isn't in something that's in your church at all, I don't think you can spend time any more wisely than on this, because if you do this for 2 years with 3 people, in 2 years you'll have 3 lay leaders that won't just be people who can check boxes like we said on committees, though those are necessary in the ways the church has been run in the past. But it's like we're failing at a basic level if all we can do is raise up lay leadership to run committee meetings. Like we need to actually raise up lay leadership that is carrying the mission of the church. And so I would encourage you to think about the end in that regard. Like I'm discipling people so that they can disciple people who will disciple people. That's the vision. That's what we're after. And I would also say that don't let yourself become discouraged when the people who say yes start to get restless about kind of like, well, what's next? I think we all kind of in this cultural moment have a little bit of kind of like attention deficit disorder and also like chasing spiritual highs. And so we like people love experiences and cool experiences. And so there's some people who can say yes to this initially because it's like, this sounds like a real spiritual challenge. And I want to be, press myself and test myself in a new way. And they'll do it. And then there's some cool stuff that happens. But then 6 weeks to 6 months in, it's kind of like, okay, well, what next? Like, what's the thing that's going to feel scary and hard and intense next? That I can shift into. And part of what happens in the class meeting is it kind of is mundane at some level, but I think it's not really like growth. It's like this, it's kind of more growth. It's like steps. Like you'll see, like I'm walking in confidence and connection to the Lord in a way I never have before. And I can maybe tell a story about exactly how that sort of step up happened. Like I know I was here and then the Lord just brought me here and I know what that was. And sometimes it's like, I'm not even sure. I just know that like there's an intimacy and fellowship that I'm having and I'm aware of with the Lord that I wasn't even looking for really before. And people can just get really excited about that, which is amazing. But then it's also when you get leveled up, you have to keep doing the things that you did that brought you there in the first place. It's like when somebody reads the Bible cover to cover for the first time, it's unlike any other book because you don't just, okay, I'm done. I've read the Bible now, and you just don't need to read it anymore. It's, the scriptures are the inspired word of God, not only, but in part because the more you read them, the more you chew on them, the more they yield, the more they offer. And I think that all of the means of grace, all of these kind of basic core spiritual practices are like that. The more that you do them, you never graduate from them. The more you do them, the more that you get from them. They bless you, over the long term, sort of more and more. Prayers like that. I think fasting is like that. I think communion is like that, and I think that the class meeting is the same. And just kind of because I'm in that space, like I'll just say too that one of the things that I think pastors and laity should sort of think about at the outset is one of the really cool things that will happen if you do this is that there will be people who will be in these groups and it'll just be kind of okay. It's good, but it's not life-changing. And then what usually happens that really pulls a group together is there's a crisis. Something happens in someone's life in the group. And then all of a sudden, like they need community. And this is the community that they have. And so they bring their story to the group, and the group is there to care for them and like pour into them and pray for them. And right, they actually have like incarnate community in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise. And that oftentimes is what kind of changes the dynamic of the group to where it's like, okay, yes, we're with each other for the long haul because now we see that like I want that too. If that happens to me, I want to have people who are going to be there to hold my hand, to be there to listen to me and to care, and that's one of the things that has really kept me going over the long term with the kind of small group formation stuff, because it just like it really bothers me to think about faithful Christian people who, when they have some kind of death in the family or really difficult personal moment, that they don't, the idea of them not having Christian community to surround them in the midst of that space is just, it's not how it's meant to be. And but it also doesn't just happen. It's not something that's just automatic. It actually takes work. And I love the Dallas Willard quote in that regard, where he says, grace is not opposed to effort, it's opposed to earning, right? So it's okay that it actually takes work to build these things that we desperately need. We just don't say, look what I did. When we receive the blessing of God through them, we just give thanks.
Yeah, so much of what you just said is resonating with me. And also, what I appreciate about your honesty, both here, but also in the book, is we're not presenting like another program for your church with 10 steps to success, or do this or X amount and get Y. But this is a spiritual discipline, and it's a place that God honors as we walk together, and create these relationships. And it has deep impact and fruit, both individually, but also corporately and in the community. I also appreciate your reminder to leaders to be okay with how people receive or don't receive it. I just
Mm-hmm.
tell you all, I've had plenty of people say this isn't for me, and you just got to be okay with them saying, all right, that's okay. I hope at some point it will be. There and really the witness and testimony that comes from others that are experiencing it becomes a witness to the people that are around it, even those that say maybe this isn't for me right now. And I just think we need to resist, particularly if you're in a larger church, to resist like hyper programming this thing and launching them all at the same time and having. I think you can. There's some things you can do there, but I think this is an organic move of the spirit
Mm-hmm.
that's about building relationships. And as you said, if I can spend a year or 2 years with 3 people, just think about the impact that that'll have multiplying out, and think about how those groups might be able to have that same multiplication impact for others that are around you. So I guess all that to say, Kevin, I just appreciate your honesty and being clear that this isn't just something else that we're selling. This is a part of who we are and part of what it means to be Christian. And it's a part of what helps us to see God at work around us and in real time. So I think that's helpful and appreciative. I see a lot of leaders that are looking for the formula on how to do it,
Mm-hmm.
which transitions me to this next point. We haven't talked much about nuts and bolts. I mean, it's 10 to 12 men and women meeting together, but you just said if you got 3 people, do it with 3 people. So give us, for those that might be in different sizes of churches, what constitutes, like, what is in the class meeting, what makes it a class meeting and what makes it not a class meeting, so that those that are thinking, okay, what do I practically do, here's who I have in front of me, how do I get this going?
Yeah, so I think at its basic level, what makes it a class meeting is if you meet on a consistent basis with the same people and you're talking about the present state of your relationship with the Lord. I think the question can probably be framed in a variety of ways, and people will land on kind of the phrasing. Like sometimes I've just noticed in some groups, like a particular phrasing of it just feels uncomfortable to people or it's awkward to them. And so it gets shifted, but it's like everybody kind of gets it. Like what we're after is like, what's going on in your relationship with God? Like what's actually happening? How are you really in your faith? And a lot of times, I don't know if you've experienced this, but in established groups, it gets to where the question's not even really asked explicitly anymore. People just go around the circle and check in basically and share what they want to share from the past week. Um, and so I think that's kind of the core of it. It's not a class meeting if you read my book and you discuss the ideas in the book as a group together and you talk about how interesting it would be if you did the scale of 1 to 10 thing and how would people react to that and would it be comfortable or not. And then when it's over, you move on to a Tim Keller, Max Lucado book or whatever. Like you just move on to a different book that you study. That's not a class meeting. So the point isn't to just learn ideas and stuff and about our history or who we were. It's not like trying to create a better like sense of team identity. It really is like this is a key it's kind of a cornerstone of how discipleship actually happens. It's branded in a particular way. We haven't really talked about this, but class meeting is actually a terrible name for what it's actually doing in our current context, because we all think if you say class, people think a classroom you go sit in and learn ideas. And, it's from a teacher up front talking to students who are hopefully sitting still and quiet. And that isn't actually what this is about, but so feel free to call them something different. But it's, basically that's the core thing is like, are you getting together as a group where every person is given an opportunity to share what's happening and in their current relationship with the Lord? And you asked, I think, another piece of that question, but I dropped it. Can you?
Yeah, no, I think you covered it. I'm just
Okay.
thinking like, you mentioned if you have three people, start with three people. So it doesn't have to have a certain number of people. It doesn't need to be exactly a certain way. I think the most important thing is not to create obstacles that don't need to be there for you to start. I
Yeah,
I talk
for
about
sure.
I talk about my setting. I have a kind of a home run when I'm starting a class that I hope that it's diverse, that it's multi-generational, that it's diverse in faith walk, that there's some that
Mhm.
are deeply mature in the faith, and there's some that are curious and trying to figure this thing out. And then that there's grandparents with new parents and singles. I just think that's a beautiful thing. I love that my home runs that it's in homes, that it's in the same home at the same time every single week. uh,
Mhm.
but at the same time, again, those are my home runs. I don't want to create those as obstacles. So if we need to have childcare in order to be able to pull off a group, we're going to have it at the church, and we're going to figure out a way to make it happen. Or I don't know if I think I told this to you years ago, but I started a group in a nursing home. Well, that's not very generationally diverse, right? Like there was a lot of people in the same kind of walk, but it was a place that people were hungry and wanted to do it, and there's power in them getting together. So I think
Yeah.
that's I just wanted to say out loud, start is like critical. And here's this is what makes it a class meeting, and however
Yeah.
you bring it together is important.
Yeah, for sure. And there was something else I meant to say and lost my thread, which was I also think like you just kind of framed it like where do you start? I think the first thing to do is this is going to sound so pious, but I really mean it is to pray and ask the Lord to show you the people that He's kind of stirring up and preparing to be in these groups. I think that there will be some sort of like intuition in that will feel like common sense. Like I just know I have a good relationship or it's easy to be around this person and I bet they would be interested in this. That's great. But I also just want to kind of encourage people to be open to the possibility that the connections that God makes could be surprising, right? Don't just assume because there's the person who always like sits in church with their arms folded, never sings the songs, and just looks like they don't really like being there. That that they don't have more going on under the surface than you can see, or that maybe what you see is where they're at, but they're also ready to be challenged and would respond to that. So, I really want to encourage people to ask God to guide and direct who they ask. Um, and then as best you can, like try to be lighthearted about that. Then ask if you feel like God's asking you to ask, John to be in it, ask him. And if he says no, then that's okay. Like you won't die because you extended an invitation and the person said that they couldn't do it or didn't want to. You'll be okay. And so you can be kind of like laid back and lighthearted about that. And I always kind of just like if it feels uncomfortable, I just name that and lead with it. Like this may seem like it's out of nowhere for you, but I just keep praying about this and you keep coming to mind, which first of all, how would our churches just be better if that kind of conversation happened? Like you were praying and you were thinking about me like that, like, and, uh, but then I just give them permission though. Like it might have just been me, but I feel like I'm supposed to ask you if you'd be willing to consider this and pray about it and see what you think, and, um, that stuff is it's really fun. It's really fun. It doesn't always go perfect, but it beats the alternatives. Playing it safe, not taking any risks, and when the Lord like you'll have times if you do that where God will give you a name of someone that you'll just be like, "There's no way," and then a year later you'll just be like, I can't believe what God has done through in this person's life. It's so amazing, and I'm so thankful that I just took that very simple risk. I mean, the when you think about it from those kind of standpoints, the risks are so trivial and small when if there's ever a possibility that a person's life actually with the Lord takes off, right, and goes to a new level.
Right.
It's awesome. We have
All
nothing to
for
lose.
all for a moment of just getting out of your comfort.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I one of the coolest things I think so as a church leader, we will preach and teach about this stuff, and we'll help organize groups, create, who wants to join and what's your schedule
Hmm.
like and all of that. But one of the coolest things is I also at the same time encourage leaders to pray about and invite people to be a part of their own group, and then we'll help you along the way. And that's an amazing experience. It's a first step of kind of leadership too. And I like watching groups as a whole pray about who they can invite to their class
Hmm.
together
Yeah.
next. That's a really neat thing, and the way the Lord might confirm that among multiple people. And it's just that's cool. It creates unity together. So
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, and
Well,
that actually reminds me of one practical thing, if I can say it real quick,
yeah,
is that in like a Bible study or particularly a Sunday school class, I think you would almost always assume, I mean, there may be exceptions in some churches, but generally speaking, it's assumed that like anybody can invite anybody else. It's kind of like worship. Like you don't need to ask the pastor, is it okay if I invite my neighbor to church? Like if you're at a church where your pastor doesn't want you to do that and wants you to ask for permission, go to a different church. Like,
yeah,
like that, you're supposed to do that. You have freedom and permission, but class meetings actually are different. I think and I'd be interested if you disagree, but I was actually in a group that was trying to be kind of a hybrid class meeting. And we had a season where different people would just like, oh, I just wanted to invite, like literally you would come to the group and there'd be a person there that you had never met before. And then someone would just say, yeah, I invited so and so. And I think that's actually it's so the right heart. Like it's such the right intentions. But if your goal is actually to kind of build vulnerability and trust and go to deeper and deeper places and kind of relational intimacy, that can be super disrupted, right? If somebody's like really struggling in their marriage and they've been talking about that for a few weeks, and then you bring in someone they don't know at all, they're not going to want to continue that conversation, and so it can be challenging. So it's not to say that the groups should be closed in like a firm sense, but just that I think what's different is that if you and I were in a band meeting and a class meeting, and I felt like I wanted to invite my friend Joe to come, I would feel like I needed to bring that to the group first. Like, hey, I really keep thinking about Joe and just feeling like the Lord is wanting me to invite him. What do you guys think about that? Is that something that you could see? And giving the group a chance to talk about it first. So anyway, that's a
yeah.
practical thing that I think is helpful.
No, I don't disagree with you at all. I've had groups that maybe somebody's going through something pretty traumatic and private, intentionally be closed for a little while
Yeah.
or stay closed for 8 to 10 weeks so they can really build that trust before they then would open themselves up to praying about who they would invite to a group. Um, I've also had groups try to not be invitational at all because they don't want to mess it up. So we try to find
Mm-hmm.
that balance a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yep.
and because these should be about multiplication, evangelism, and inviting people to be a part of it. So you just have to strike that balance as a leader of helping classes to see that balance and how they can work through that. But
Yeah,
I think
that's
you said
good.
it well. Yeah. Well, Kevin, let's talk about some Q&A here. We've got a few questions that have been given, and Zach, if you at any point need to get on to ask any of them, let us know. You can do that. But I'll start with what I see in the Q&A. The first one, we haven't talked about bands very much, Kevin. And so how do class meetings, this is Bob's question, Bob Hager, how do class meetings and bands work together for discipleship? What are those relationships and how can you see that in the local church?
Yeah, I think that the class meeting is for everybody. So the expectation is that anyone who is connected to your church in a consistent way, not just the first time visitor, but it's the ideal would be that everybody is connected to a class meeting. That's how it worked in early Methodism. Band meetings were like a deeper cut of people who have come to faith in the Lord, and their faith is like they're pressing after entire sanctification, and so they're wanting the whole thing. And they were always voluntary, and they were never, you wouldn't get removed from membership in Methodism if you didn't attend a band meeting, but for many decades in Methodism you would if you weren't attending your class meeting. So it's a pretty big difference. The bands were also divided by gender. So like one thing that I've noticed in a lot of evangelical non-denominational churches is that they'll have a small group ministry where that is like co-ed every other week, and then divides, and then like week 2 is like just men and week 4 is just women. And so there's this kind of instinct that we know that there's some things that it's easier to talk about if it's just men together with men, and things that are easier for women to talk about if there aren't men around, and so forth. And so that's a piece of it too, is really basically in the band meeting, you're confessing sin, like you're trying to purge sin for the sake of growth and holiness. And so it's a deeper step. It's more intimate and even more vulnerable. And so as a result, it requires greater trust, and they're also smaller. Band meetings would usually have 3 to 5 people in them. So
Yeah, that's good. I think pragmatically, like just practically in the church, I have talked about class meetings very public and tried to invite any and all that would be a part of class meetings, and band groups we do much more organic, and invite people. Sometimes I'll come across 3 or 4 people just in my pastor's office. I'm like, these 4 need to be together in a band. I know it. They're hungry for more. And I've seen a lot of people in classes end up wanting to experience more, and the band group is the right thing to go to and add into their spiritual practices.
yeah.
So yeah, I've seen that play out in different ways, but some churches go all in at bands. I haven't experienced in my context. I think bands are a really deep place to start with a general group that's experiencing the kind of church that we've experienced in our time and in our country. To jump into a band is like almost unproductive because we haven't taken the steps that lead up to that. And so class meeting is something that I really think is a great step. So, okay, another question from Duncan Williams. In your book, Kevin, you describe how a single class meeting may start and then spin off in new groups, meeting at random times at random places throughout the week. Do you think at the inception of the GMC, there's an opportunity to start these groups on a large scale through adding to the Sunday morning schedule? In other words, should we figure out, these are important, should we figure out maybe even like Sunday morning, how do we put in every classroom on the church campus these class meetings? Is that something we should think about? Why or why not?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love that. I'll say that I think, especially for new church starts, I think that would be, so I got to preach at a church in North Oklahoma City, a new church plant, last Sunday, a week ago today. And they were actually saying during the announcements that that's the first kind of big step after just launching the church and having weekly worship, is going to be starting class meetings and trying to do some teaching on that, figuring out who's interested in that kind of thing. So I think there is a real opportunity. I think that it does make sense in terms of like time constraints and things like that, to pair it up with Sunday worship. So if you have an opportunity to have basically a class meeting hour and a worship hour, I think that's a great thing. And in a lot of contexts, you could actually you could reverse those. If you had 2 worship services, right, you could have class meetings during both times so that people have a chance to have either sync up with the people they have felt connected to and made connections with when they first came to the church, or based on the worship service they attend, and that kind of thing. So I think it's a great idea. I think that the challenge of I'm kind of like a total pragmatist on this stuff, and I'm learning so much from the doing. So I'm in favor of taking risks. I'm in favor of trying things. And so I'd say if you see the opportunity and you see a path to doing it, like go for it, go big, and trust the Lord to make a way. The challenge that I've experienced, and John Wayne, I'm assuming is probably similar for you from the things that you've said, but you can speak to it however you want, of course, is raising up enough class leaders. Like that's usually for me the challenge of like large scale launches, is if you're in a church that hasn't done anything like this at all, it's hard to start 20 class meetings because that assumes that you have 20 people who are ready to lead those groups, and that can be a real challenge. I was at a new church plant in East Dallas. It was called Munger Place Church back when I was in my PhD program. And one of the ways we addressed that is we did, during the time that was planning for the launch of the new church, we started a group. They were called kitchen groups there. And ours, but they were basically class meetings. But we met for, I don't know, I think it was probably around a year. But it was with the understanding that when the church actually launched, that we would divide up in twos to lead new small groups, so that there would be the opportunity to provide provide 6 groups for the new church out of the gate, and then hopefully kind of continue from there. And I thought that worked pretty well because it allowed the planting pastor to kind of like impart spiritual DNA into this group he was meeting with every week for a season, so that when those groups then spread to places where he wasn't present, that there was at least some sense of like a pattern has been created, and that kind of thing. So I thought that worked pretty well and was helpful. I do think big picture that the GMC would really miss a moment of opportunity if it didn't do exactly what East Texas is doing and see this as the right time to sort of plant a flag and say, look, we're going to make mistakes. Every class meeting we start isn't going to work. They sometimes, like, small groups are like organisms, and that means they die and their lifespans are different. They're not all the same. And so there'll be hiccups, there will be mistakes, there'll be failures, and that's okay. But there's also going to be a lot of victory and some cool testimonies and stories of what the Lord does if we just kind of determine to move in this direction and relearn how to do it. It just takes people like John Wayne, who I see as an expert practitioner, but 5 years ago, you weren't doing anything with class meetings, right? So it's
right. Learned a lot of lessons along the way, a lot of failures and a lot of mess ups. And that's hard for me. I like to control everything. So it's been a sanctifying journey for me too. I'm a big believer in spending time with leaders before launching the groups. And so my practice, it doesn't have to be for everyone, but my practice is to actually use Kevin's book and do a class meeting for 8 to 10 weeks with potential leaders. And then I want them to self-select their calling as leaders. So I give them an out at the end. Maybe they're called to be a part of a group and not lead one yet, or maybe they're ready to lead, or hopefully at least they learn some transformative practices for their Sunday school and things like that. So that at the end, I've got maybe half the room is like, no, I'm in, I'm ready to lead and I want to do this. Or some others are saying, no, not yet. Because what I've seen is largely groups are successful. I hate that word, but groups find their way in the class meeting based on if that leader understands what the class meeting is at least practiced in some way at how to make space for what God wants to do in the room, and can learn a little bit of leadership. And so to the best of my ability, I try to show what a class leader is for 8 to 10 weeks before we launch them, and then provide support, much like the early Methodists. How can I become now someone who supports those class leaders in continuing growth and checking in with them and seeing how things are going?
Yeah, that's good. And I want to just sort of highlight what you said, and agree with it, that in a sense, class meeting leadership, learning to do class meeting stuff, it's kind of an apprenticeship model. So exactly what you said is right, that you're showing, like, here's how you hold space, here's how you help people to step in if they're tending to hold back, here's how you help people to wrap it up if they're tending to talk too long, and those kind of things. And I think it's helpful to say this. There are very few people who just intuitively are like, we're born knowing how to do this, but it also is not that hard to teach. Like, there's skills that actually can be taught to a very wide range of people. It's probably not everybody, but I think it's a very large percentage of people in the church would be capable of doing this if they were willing to step in, with someone like yourself being willing to help launch them, right? Give them a sense of like, here, you could, like, it's that the apprenticeship thing is like, I do, you watch, we do it together, then you do it and I watch. And I think if you have spaces like that, it helps to lower the risk for folks, and in terms of stepping in.
Yeah, I agree. And I think also there's opportunity for class leaders to find someone who can come up as a leader within their class meeting, as a potential way to multiply and grow these things. So we talk about that a lot. Who else could you intentionally help to grow into this role as a leader in the future? All right, so I'm going to keep moving. So I want to be respectful of your time. Are you okay on time for another 10, 15 minutes? Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so I think we just answered this. What is the specific role of the pastor in a class meeting? Does the pastor participate to help a class launch? Yes. The only thing I've seen colleagues try and lead like 4 or 5 class meetings. I don't think that's the best practice. I think if you help at the launch and then you've identified someone that can lead that, like co-lead with you for a while, and then they take it on later on. Or the model I was just talking about training leaders and then helping them to launch. I just would, now I think Kevin says this pretty clearly in the book. As a pastor, you gotta believe in this and be a part of it if your church is gonna be a part of it. If you're gonna say yes to this, so it has to happen on Sunday morning from the pulpit. It has to happen by your leadership. So I think that's really critical.
Yep. You have to buy what you're selling.
Yeah.
Okay. I would say the only thing I would
Go
say
ahead.
like different is, I don't disagree with anything that you said, but I could also see someone like you eventually getting to the place where you feel like in the same apprenticeship way, you've actually raised up someone who can take on sort of the class meeting ministry. I don't think that by definition has to be a pastoral role. But I do think it should be a particular person who's carrying it and kind of has ownership and responsibility for it.
Yeah. The first church I served, where we saw like 18 of these groups, eventually we had a lay person that was actually training leaders
Yeah.
and was kind of overseeing it all. And that was a great experience. So I think that's right. Okay. How do you respond to a time deficit that most people feel they have? Especially young families, at least in my context, with extracurricular activities and everything that happens every night of the week. And we have Sunday school and Bible study, and now you're asking me to do one more thing. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I think that I'm a pretty big believer that I think one of the things that leaders do is that they tell people, they provide clarity that these are our priorities. Like, if we get to set the priorities for you and your family, here's what they would look like. And then people get to make a decision about whether they'll respond to those, do what's being asked or not. They can always say, well, no, I just want to go to church, or I just want to do this or that. And, candidly, we kind of know that most lay people aren't willing to go to church every Sunday. And so there's not a commitment to just, basic routines in that sense. For, it varies within every church, but every church has a variety of levels of commitment within the congregation. I am generally a fan of, or a believer in, setting like strong expectations for what I believe should be people's top priority, which I do think that one of the greatest challenges of our present age is helping people to actually truthfully have the gospel at the center of their lives in terms of how they spend their time and money. Um, and and so this is a place where I tend to not lean as much into a marketing type approach. Like, I'm not going to work really hard to sell you on this being convenient and it'll work. Like, you can still do all the other worldly things you want to do and just get this extra little bit of Jesus. And I'm not saying that's what the person asking the question is intending. I'm just saying that I feel that temptation in myself. So I think that as church leaders, we have to get clear on, if we could get people to do 4 things, what would they be? And what would the order of them be? Like, we need to actually know that in our own thinking so that it's clear to the people that if I am like really committed to this, these are the 4 things that my pastor is saying I should be doing every week. And I know what they are and I know I'm doing them. So I know that like this is the win from the church's perspective, but they also should be like ranked in some sense. And I think it's fair game to ask for 2 to 3 hours a week. And I think that if you do that, then you have the opportunity to participate in worship, which I think should be first. And I think then you have the opportunity to be in a class meeting, which I think should be second. And I think you have the opportunity, and there are seasons. Like, I think that something like confirmation, some kind of basic catechism, there's a season where that would be like the clear, like, second priority for a person.
Right.
But generally speaking, big picture, I think the class meeting is the second thing that a person ought to do. And then the third one would be some kind of like context where you're reading scripture and continuing to learn and grow in your understanding of your faith. And a lot of people are going to choose travel baseball instead. But I'm not going to lead as best I can by the grace of God in a way that encourages that. But instead, I'm going to try to have the best priorities. And then also to think strategically about how can I help them to say yes to the gospel, even if they're also wanting to say yes to things that are good, that are they're not bad things. They're problematic if they're choking out the space for your family to worship and follow the Lord. So like our church has started a Thursday night service, and we lean into that as like, if you can't be in church on Sunday, that's okay. Come to the Thursday night service. Like, we really believe that you should go to worship every week. And so like, this is our attempt to kind of remove that excuse in a sense. It's like, you have some reason you can't come to church on Sunday. Totally get it. It's fine. Will you consider coming to the Thursday evening service that's in a completely different place in the schedule, where there's a pretty good chance if you can't come to church on Sunday, you can come Thursday night. And then at least people have the clarity of like, I just don't want to, I'm not willing to, right? I just think it's good to kind of know where you stand in that sense.
Yeah, it's good. We need to be, as leaders, clear that we do think that something like this is more important than travel baseball, and have the courage to at least say it out loud. Now, can you get everyone to choose that or make that decision for themselves? That's a different story, but we haven't often kind of stated it clearly about how important this is, and witnessed to it and given a compelling reason of why it is.
Yep.
All right. This I'll come back to this one as a Methodist question. Are you familiar with Emmaus groups?
Mm-hmm.
Union groups. Someone asked a question about class meetings and bands being pretty similar to that. You would say that's probably one of the closer experiences or groups to this.
Almost every time that I do like an hour-long teaching on like, here's what for a long time, what I would do in this context would have been more just like historical, like this is what this was. And almost every time people come up to me afterwards and they're like, that's like an Emmaus reunion group. So I think they were actually intentionally created to be similar to the, I think they are kind of almost like a hybrid of, the class and band meeting.
Yeah, and I would just say to anybody that's been on Emmaus and are a part of Emmaus reunion groups, think about how fruitful and impactful those can be and have been to you, and how something similar to that would be fruitful and a blessing to your local congregation. Okay, the risk of a pastor being in a class meeting or a band meeting with congregants. I'm interested in your take before I say anything here, because I think this is a challenge that we have to think clearly about a pastor being in a band meeting with congregants or in a class with congregants.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it's a complicated one. The first thing I would say is that I think that the pastor, him or herself, needs to do what, like, you shouldn't, there isn't a universal answer where like, whether you're comfortable with it or not, you should do it. So one way you could get a universal answer is if I just said it's inappropriate for a pastor to ever be in a group with parishioners. I don't think that's true. I'm not convinced that that's the case, but I can see someone feeling like they just have a hard time being in that space. And so then, like you said before, they need to be in a class meeting with other pastors then, and be able to talk about that and the work that it's doing in their church and so forth. I think that there are risks in terms of like, if the pastor is going to be really vulnerable, and if there's places where they're struggling, then I think there are places where that would be the place where there's a no, is like, if a pastor is struggling in a place that isn't appropriate for church members to know about, or would be harmful to the church in some way, then they need to find the appropriate place to engage in those ways. But these conversations always make me uncomfortable, because I think there's almost like an implication that like, if you're sinning, instead of telling anybody, you should just not tell anybody. And actually, like, it shouldn't be that we clutch our pearls if we find out that someone's really struggling, but instead, like, the Wesleyan approach is always like, we believe that there's one who's able and willing to like bring healing and wholeness in this place. And I do think there are times when people need to be removed from ministry or have a break from ministry. I mean, that stuff is all super complicated. So I'm not trying to have like, one size fits all approaches to that. But I don't believe that sort of by definition it's wrong for pastors to be participants in groups. And part of that for me is like, the first time I was invited to be in a band meeting was before I was invited to be in a class meeting, and it was with two professors of mine when I was in seminary. So it was very vulnerable for them to do that, and I'm really thankful, because I got to have a different kind of relationship that was pretty unique to those two people, that I wouldn't have had, if I hadn't been invited into that group. And I think it also marked me to carry it in a way that I probably wouldn't have been if they hadn't actually walked through that experience with me as someone who wasn't an expert teaching me about it, but was a follower of Jesus walking through it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I agree completely. I think it's, especially if you take one at a time in the class meeting, I really think it's important for us to be a part of them. I think you can witness to your faith and what God's doing in your life in careful ways that wouldn't create harm in the group. There's a lot of ways to answer that question, and so sometimes I am careful that I'm not airing out, a struggle I'm having with a staff member as part of my share or something like that, so that I wouldn't create harm to anybody in that setting. So you're careful. One of the most fruitful experiences was finding a class leader that would feel comfortable with me being in their class meeting as a pastor, so that my wife and I could be in a class that I was not leading. And I thought that was really a fruitful experience, and the Lord blessed that in amazing ways. I will say I think it's really complicated with a band meeting. You got to be really careful there, I think, for sure. I think when you're in a band meeting, Kevin, you might agree with this or not. But I think you change the nature of the relationship with
Mm-hmm.
pastor and congregant once you confess sin in that way. And it's not to say that we should hide the fact that we sin and we need to confess that. It's just, it does change the relationship. So you really need to invite people to be prayerful about joining your group as a pastor when you're putting a band together. And in this season right now, I haven't found folks that I feel comfortable, so I'm in a band group outside of the church with
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
other leaders.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to keep moving here. What is a good technique, or how do you create confidentiality and trust, and what do you do if it's broken in a class meeting?
Yeah, I think that's something that needs to be talked about explicitly and pretty regularly. In terms of, I feel like confidentiality is the most kind of essential quality for these groups, and if it's broken, it really breaks the group. So it's probably the one thing that I would be most clear that if there's, and I don't even know if I always struggle a little bit about this, kind of speaking about it live to groups of people, but to me, it's almost like I don't really mean this, but it's almost like the unpardonable sin of small group formation stuff. Like I probably would say if I was doing trainings, if you break confidence in this group, like you'll be removed from the group, because it's a precious gift to be able to be a part of it. And by breaking confidence, you're taking control away from the rest of the group to destroy it, because the group is just rationally, it's not going to continue to meet if you're telling what's happening in the group to other people that aren't in the group. It's a rational response to say, I'm not coming anymore. And so rather than allowing a person to do that, it makes more sense to just tell them they can't come anymore, so that the rest of the group can continue having an appropriate and healthy place where confidentiality is honored. And I think it's a place where you do sometimes, unfortunately, uncover some real spiritual maturity in the church, where people just have kind of minimized and rationalized gossip as something that isn't that big of a deal and doesn't hurt anybody, and it actually really does. So I think it's a really big deal, and I think for me, you just take it head on and you just say, this is not permitted, it's not acceptable, and there will be, the church will respond if there's a problem with gossip in the group, for the sake of the health of the group as a whole, and so that people can keep growing in their faith.
Yeah, I think, and that's one of those hard lessons that a class leader is going to have to learn how to deal with when it happens, because you're right. And I think it's one of the challenges we didn't get to talk to a whole lot, but I think one of the challenges we have is we have not submitted to or led with accountability that would call that out all the time in the church and to do
Yep.
something about it. And so that's a challenge for sure.
Yep.
What was the four primary focuses you mentioned? I don't know if those were just things you were listing off as examples, but you talked about worship, class meeting, reading scripture, and was there a fourth one?
Yeah, I didn't actually name a fourth one. I think probably in my head, I just was saying that you need to
Yeah.
establish what those priorities are. I think probably I was thinking about the band meeting as the other one, in terms of probably why I came up with four.
Yeah.
Most people, I think realistically, you're right. Like most people are probably going to be in the class meeting or the band meeting. And if I had a church where everybody was in a class or a band meeting, I'd do cartwheels. I mean, that would be a
Yeah,
huge win.
that's
So
right. That's right. Okay, Duncan Williams. Does anyone want to start a class meeting leadership support group? Hey, Duncan, reach out to me. And as the committee, we'll see if we can get something like this working or support you in the meantime.
That's
And then,
awesome.
yeah, that's great. And then last question that we have here, and then I want to end this. So thank you everyone for your Q&A and questions that you put forward, and for those that are watching. But this last question is more of a kind of your take on a historical Methodism and how it might speak into rural settings. So with a shortage of pastors and decline in rural churches, is there application following the model of the first 75 years of Methodism in America of a pastor preaching once or twice a month using lay speakers to rotate through several churches? Do you see that as a need to, I think we're probably experiencing that a lot right now in the GFC in different places, a shortage of pastors to serve these appointments, an inability for churches to be able to pay a full-time clergy.
Yep.
All of those may be a long-term challenge for us, Kevin. So do you see something in our history that might speak into that?
Yeah, I do. I think it is relevant. I think there's two kind of ways that that could happen. One is that you could have a kind of bivocational model where someone has another job or a primary source of income, but is called to preach the gospel, and so does go to churches that can't support a full-time and full benefits package for a pastor, but is able to provide that key support role. And I actually love the question in the context of this conversation, because a person that could really be like missional dynamite in the best way would be someone who can preach and in a way that's a blessing to these different communities, but also has a heart for class meetings and is like marked to raise up people for this ministry. Because if you were doing both of those things, preaching, like basically coming in to like lead a worship service, but also like equipping how to start class meetings, you would create those are the kind of key tools, I think, is that churches, because the class meeting piece, as we're talking about it, is about lay leadership. So you need to both help raise up lay leadership that's there every day on the ground, but also provide kind of the spiritual covering in terms of leadership that's coming. One of the things I just throw out there, that I've thought about as a model that I think could be really interesting, is for a way for some of, like, I feel like some of the larger churches are wrestling with like, what's their role in the GMC? Do they want to be a part of it? Like, how do these things work? There's some instances where some really large churches, if they join the GMC, they'd like break the budget for the conference in a way that I think would actually be unhealthy for the conference itself. And I think one way that you could have some really cool like relationships would be if a larger church actually had a traveling evangelist on staff that was under their budget, but was basically like their job, at least part of their job, was to actually go from that church to preach in other contexts on Sunday morning. And I think that could be really powerful, because a lot of our larger churches have larger pastoral staffs, but the senior pastor preaches every Sunday, and so it would also give an opportunity for some of those really brilliant gifted associates to get to do more preaching in different spaces too. So I think there's some interesting opportunities for creative ministry context. But to the question, yes, I think having basically some version of circuit riding preachers that are combined with class leaders would be great. And I think that it might be that the best way to think about starting church plants is actually house churches, basically, where you're starting with a class meeting, and if that grows, then at some point you move to a public worship service somewhere that then could have 2 or 3 class meetings that are meeting outside of that time.
Kevin, I have to ask this last question because it came through and it's fascinating to me. So, and then I promise no more Q&A and we'll close it down. But Zach says, in Pacific Island countries, it is culturally taboo to expose oneself to the community in order to keep the name of their family. So I'm thinking honor shame kind of culture. There's a rise in Methodism in this region, but how do we implement class and band meetings to this region? There's a form of this type of meeting that goes on in the Pacific called cell groups that meet weekly, but it does not go deep in vulnerable ways like the class and the bands. So what do you do in a different culture like that, or how would you respond to that?
It's a great question. I think the challenge of kind of cultural translation is being clear about what the essentials are and where the places are that the gospel can be uh, adapted for cultural reasons, and so they can be embedded. Thinking just through like uh, the scripture passage is always used as the justification for the band meeting as James 5:16, and that seems like something that would be the kind of thing that would go beyond cultural adaptability. So James 5:16 says, therefore confess your sins to one another and pray for one another that you might be healed. And so I think that would be a place where I would be trying to find a way as a missionary to work with like this. To me, I think it'd be part of the conversion that was happening, is that this is in the church. We're not doing this in the community, we're doing this within the church, and within the church, this is actually a healthy building up thing, and we can show you why according to the tenets and convictions of our faith.
Yeah, that's good. I haven't thought about that in a different
Yeah,
cultural.
that's a good question.
Really,
That's,
really
I
interesting.
mean, and I don't know how good that answer was, but that's what I got off the cuff.
Yeah, I don't have much else to add. I mean, I would again, don't create more obstacles that are there. Find a way to get at the heart of this in your context if it's important. There may be some ways that you need to create more trust and vulnerability, or trust and confidentiality in a group. Be hyper protective there, and hyper important. So okay, let me wrap this up with Kevin. Any last thoughts or encouragement to, we've got over 60 people that are still with us, and a lot more that'll see this later on. So any last words or encouragement that you would give to those that are listening?
Yeah, I just think I just want to say that I've kind of said this before, but this is where I want to end. Like, my experience really has been that it's always vulnerable to say, "Hey, we're going to create space to share about what God's been doing in our lives." I always end my classes that I teach with that. Like, we do a love feast at the end of the semester, and I always ask students to just think about what they would share of their experience of God's work in their lives throughout the semester, not even particularly related to the course. And every time, I'm always convinced at some level, there's a part of me that thinks no one's going to have anything to say this time. And I think I've only ever done that one time in all my years of teaching and all the classes I've taught, where somebody didn't cry, like in a good way, like it's like it's a really powerful time. And the time that nobody cried, it still felt like it was exactly what it was supposed to be. It was just like, I was like, oh, somebody always cries. Nobody cried today. And so just the encouragement, one, that it's okay that it's vulnerable. Like, you're not doing something wrong if it feels vulnerable. If you kind of have this a little bit of concern that what if nothing happens, it's totally normal. But also that from people like me who have been in this for a pretty good amount of time, the reason I keep doing it is because it works, because I see the Lord give testimonies to people, and that's what we're doing. That's what we're about. I mean, there was somebody who shared in the Q&A that they've seen people get saved, come to faith in Jesus through this, and praise the Lord. I mean, we're just pragmatists on this stuff. That's what we're about, is helping people to come to know Jesus and then give their whole selves to him. And in order for that to happen, time and time again, we just see that when people are left to themselves, they tend to get taken out by the enemy. But when they band together with brothers and sisters in the faith, they tend to get stronger and grow in the faith, even though they still will face adversity and challenges. So I just want to encourage people to give it a shot, and keep going, and to know that in both Zach and John Wayne, you've got some expert folks that can help you with this. So lean on them.
Amen. I can't say it any better. So I'm grateful for you, Kevin. Thank you for everything. Prayers and blessings upon your ministry and your continued work. It's I joke about how many of these dadgum books that we've bought, but they really are a gift, and I think a great tool and resource for the church, as is all your writing. And I'm grateful for you and your time today to be with us. And I know that all of our folks are grateful as well. So thank you very much, Kevin. We'll talk soon. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks. God bless you.
All right. God bless you.